Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Rabbi yassir wa a'in ya kareem, waftah bil haqqi innaka al-fattahul alim. A couple of important announcements for people in the group. Firstly, if you are intending to join the Alhambra visit tomorrow and you haven't yet signed the list, which is in the cafeteria, you have to do that right away, or there won't be a place for you or a ticket when you arrive. And secondly, inshallah, at 8 today, instead of our regular little dhikr session, there will be a group of professional singers coming up from Granada to sing various things in Spanish and Arabic, inshallah, and Ali Kila will be leading them. So that will be outside in the courtyard, and that's part of the program, and inshallah it will be one of the highlights. We move on now in the Kitab Afat al-Lisan to Al-Afat al-Thalitha Ashara, the 13th defect, which is Al-Wa'ad al-Kadhib, a dishonest promise. فإن اللسان سباق إلى الوعد ثم النفس ربما لا تسمح بالوفاء. The tongue likes to race to making promises, but then the nafs, the ego, may well not allow us to follow up and to fulfill that promise. فَيَصِيرُ الْوَعْدُ خُلْفًا, so that we end up breaking the promise. وَذَلِكَ مِنْ أَمَارَاتِ النِّفَاقِ, and that is one of the tokens of nifaq or hypocrisy. قال الله تعالى يا أيها الذين آمنوا أوفوا بالعقود. O you who have iman, fulfill your promises, your contracts, your pledges. وقال صلى الله عليه وسلم العدة عطية. And he said, صلى الله عليه وسلم, that a promise is a gift. And what this means is that you shouldn't take it back again. Just as a gift is something that can't be reclaimed when you change your mind. Similarly, if you promise somebody something, you can't change your mind and go back on your promise. وقال صلى الله عليه وسلم الوأي مثل الدين أو أفضل. And he said, صلى الله عليه وسلم, that a promise is like a debt, or even higher. That is to say, once you promise something, you are, as it were, in a debt relationship with the person to whom you've made the promise, and you have to repay. وَقَدْ أَثْنَى اللَّهُ تَعَالَى عَلَى نَبِيِّهِ إِسْمَاعِيلَ عَلَيْهِ السَّلَامِ. And Allah has praised His Prophet Ismail, peace be upon him, فِي كِتَابِهِ الْعَزِيزِ فَقَالَ إِنَّهُ كَانَ صَادِقَ الْوَعْدِ. He was true, faithful to his promises. قِيلَ إِنَّهُ وَعَدَ إِنسَانًا فِي مَوْضِعٍ فَلَمْ يَرْجِعْ إِلَيْهِ ذَلِكَ الْإِنسَانِ. It said, this is the tafsir of that ayah, that Ismail once promised to meet somebody in a place, but that person didn't come back to that place. بل نسي, in fact he just forgot. فبقي إسماعيل 22 يوما في انتظاره. And Ismail waited for 22 days for that person to show up. ولما حضرت عبد الله ibn Umar الوفاة, and when death came to Abdullah ibn Umar, قال إنه كان خطب لابنتي رجل من قريش. One of the last things he said was, a man from Quraysh sought my daughter's hand in marriage. وقد كان مني إليه شبه الوعد, and there was a kind of promise, an understanding between us. فوالله لا ألقى الله بثلث النفاق, and by Allah I will never meet my Lord with a third of nifaq, with a third of hypocrisy. أشهدكم أني قد زوجته ابنتي. I call you all to witness that I have given my daughter in marriage to him. وقيل لإبراهيم الرجل يواعد الرجل الميعاد فلا يجيء قال ينتظره إلى أن يدخل وقت الصلاة. And it was said to Ibrahim, and this would be Ibrahim ben Adham, a man promises to meet somebody in a particular rendezvous, but then doesn't turn up So what should he do? And he said the other person should wait until the time for prayer comes. And this is a view that many of the ulama will say, that if you've got a date, you're meeting with somebody at a particular time, it's good to wait until the next time of prayer, and then it's fine for you to depart. وكان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم إذا وعد وعدا قال عسى. And the Prophet ﷺ, when he made a promise, would say perhaps, or it may be. وكان ابن مسعود لا يعد وعدا إلا ويقول إن شاء الله. And Ibn Mas'ud would never make a promise without saying إن شاء الله وهو الأولى, and this is what is preferable. ثم إذا فهم مع ذلك الجزم في الوعد فلا بد من الوفاء. But even so, if what's understood at the time of your making the promise, I will definitely see you Tuesday afternoon at 3 o'clock, or whatever it might be, if the form of your promise indicates that you're definite about that, then unless you apologize, or unless you have some excuse, إلا أن يتعذر, فإن كان عند الوقت عازما على أن لا يفي فهذا هو النفاق. If at the time when you're making this promise, you actually think that, well, maybe you won't do it, or you definitely won't do it, then that is what is hypocrisy. If there's an excuse, it's not hypocrisy. If you forget, it's not hypocrisy. But if you simply change your mind, you can't be bothered, or at the time of making the promise you don't really mean it, then this is what the Holy Prophet is indicating when he says that a false promise is a form of hypocrisy. وقال أبو هريرة قال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم ثلاث من كن فيه فهو منافق. There are three things which, if present in a man, make him a hypocrite. إن صام وصلى وزعم أنه مسلم. Even if he prays and fasts and claims that he's a Muslim. إذا حدث كذب. If when he speaks he tells lies. وإذا وعد أخلف. And if when he makes a promise he breaks his promise. وإذا اؤتمن خان. And if, when entrusted with something, he breaks that trust. وقال عبد الله بن عمرو رضي الله عنهما قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم أربع من كن فيه كان منافقا. There are four things which, if present in a man, make him a hypocrite. ومن كانت فيه خلة منهن كان له خلة من النفاق. And if you have some share of these things, then you have some share of hypocrisy. حتى يدعها, until you give them up. إذا حدث كذب. When he speaks, he lies. وإذا وعد أخلف. When he promises, he breaks his promise. وإذا عاهد غدر. And when he enters into a contract or a pledge, he betrays it. وإذا خاصم فجر. And when he disputes, he goes beyond the bounds of lawful courtesy. وهذا ينزل على من وعد وهو على عزم الخلف. And all of this refers to the person who is making a promise but thinks or is determined that he's going to break that promise. أو ترك الوفاء من غير عذر, or fails to keep the pledge without having an excuse. فأما من عزم على الوفاء فله عذر منعه من الوفاء لم يكن منافقا. But if you do have a genuine excuse which prevents you from fulfilling it, then you're not considered to be a munafiq. وإن جرى عليه ما هو صورة النفاق. Even if on the surface or by appearance there is a form of hypocrisy. ولكن ينبغي أن يحترز من صورة النفاق أيضا. And you should beware of situations where you look like a hypocrite as well. كما يحترز من حقيقته, just as much as you avoid the reality of hypocrisy. ولا ينبغي أن يجعل نفسه معذورا من غير ضرورة. And you shouldn't find excuses unless they're really essential excuses which actually prevent you genuinely from attending. So that's the end of the 13th defect. والآفة الرابعة عشرة, the 14th defect, الكذب في القول واليمين. Lying in speech and in oaths. وهو من قبائح الذنوب, and this is one of the ugly sins. وفواحش العيوب, and the corrupt faults in a human being. قال إسماعيل بن واسط سمعت أبا بكر الصديق رضي الله عنه يخطب بعد وفاة رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. Ismail bin Wasit said, I heard Abu Bakr as-Siddiq رضي الله عنه giving a khutbah after the death of the Holy Prophet. فقال قام فينا رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم مقامي هذا. Once Allah's Messenger stood in this place where I'm now standing. ثم بكى, and then he wept. وقال إياكم والكذب, beware of lying. فإنه مع الفجور وهما في النار, because it is the accomplice of corruption and they are both in hellfire. وقال أبو أمامة قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم إن الكذب باب من أبواب النفاق. The Holy Prophet said, lying is one of the gateways of hypocrisy. وقال الحسن, this is Al-Hasan al-Basri, كان يقال إن من النفاق اختلاف السر والعلانية والقول والعمل والمدخل والمخرج. The sense of hypocrisy is that there should be a difference between one's secret and one's public facade, and what one says and what one does, and how one goes into things and how one ends up actually behaving. وَإِنَّ الْأَصْلَ الَّذِي بُنِيَ عَلَيْهِ نِفَاقُ الْكَذِبِ. But the actual foundation on which hypocrisy is built is lying, is falsehood. وقال عليه السلام كبرت خيانة أن تحدث أخاك حديثا هو لك به مصدق وأنت له به كاذب. The Holy Prophet said, it is an immense act of betrayal that you should say something to your brother which he believes but which you yourself do not believe. وقال ابن مسعود كان النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم قال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم لا يزال العبد يكذب ويتحرى الكذب حتى يكتب عند الله كذابا. A slave of Allah lies and continues to lie until he is written in Allah's sight as a liar. ومر رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم برجلين يتبايعان شاة ويتحالفان. The Holy Prophet went past two men who were haggling over the price of a sheep, and they were making oaths to each other. يقول أحدهما, one of them was saying, والله لا أنقصك من كذا وكذا. By Allah, I will not go below such and such a price. ويقول الآخر, and the other was saying, والله لا أزيدك على كذا وكذا. The other said, by Allah, I won't go above such and such a price. فمر بالشاة وقد اشتراها أحدهما. And then he saw the sheep again when one of them had bought it. The merchants or the traders are corrupt. فقيل يا رسول الله أليس قد أحل الله البيع. يا رسول الله, has Allah not permitted buying and selling, trading? قال نعم ولكنهم يحلفون فيأثمون ويحدثون فيكذبون. And he said, yes, but what they do is that they make promises and then sin and say things but lie. And this is something that Imam Al Ghazali talks about elsewhere in the Ihya. Kitab Adab al-Kasb, which is one of the most tremendous books in the Ihya. The Kitab Adab al-Kasb means the book of the proprieties of earning a living. And it's really mostly about what nowadays we would refer to as business ethics. And this issue of deceit in buying and selling is a big one. It's particularly important in Sharia. And there's a number of hadiths about this. لِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ آفَةٌ وَآفَةُ التِّجَارَةِ الْكَذِبِ. In everything there is a defect, and the defect of trading is lying. That's the great temptation. You lie about all kinds of things. You lie about the source of your goods. You could say, oh, this suit was made in Savile Row, whereas in fact you had it made in Karachi. Or you could say, I will deliver it by next week at the latest, whereas in fact you're lying because you know you won't have it by that date. Or you could say, this wheat is of premier quality, whereas in fact it's defective. Or you can display your goods in such a way as to be misleading. So you put the good stuff at the top and the rotten stuff underneath. Or you can enter into contractual agreements that you might not intend to fulfill, such as, well, if you don't like it, you can bring it back again. And in fact, when he does do that, it turns out that you didn't mean it. So this is afatu tijara al-kadib. The drawback or the pitfall of trading is lying. And we have in our tradition a very extensive literature of commercial ethics, business ethics, books, which indicate the way in which even so worldly, also apparently worldly a pursuit as buying and selling, turning an honest dollar, making a living, is something that in the vision of classical Islam was incorporated in a complete image of society in which every vocation had the potential to be a holy calling. And this is something that in the Western tradition is almost unimaginable. Where there are sacred spaces still, it's perhaps a prayer room in an airport that's hardly used, or perhaps a church attended by a few old people, but everything else is mammon, everything else is the world of buying and selling and pleasure and ego. And it's assumed that that's how it has to be. The sacred is pushed into a smaller and smaller and dustier little broom cupboard until it might as well not exist. But in Islamic civilization, we do not have a distinction between the sacred and the profane. Because if the sacred means that in which Allah's name can appropriately be mentioned and should be mentioned, then there is no context, no human activity in which that is not appropriate. The only thing that looks like profanity is sin, and any profession that is trading in sin, alcohol peddling, for instance, or prostitution, is not regarded as a Sharia valid transaction anyway, and such contracts are invalid. They have no place in an Islamic economy. But everything else, all of the other professions, whether it be medicine, engineering, the law, you name it, the military, all of these had forms in our classical civilization which enabled them to be fully sacred callings. That one would join a guild, that one would have a particular spiritual teacher who would enable one to get the most spiritually out of one's time at work. One would have a sense of service, one would have a sense of fellowship, rather than the modern Adam Smith capitalistic dog-eat-dog competition model, in which as long as you're not actually breaking the law, then anything you do to maximize profits is regarded as being part of being a good businessman or a banker. And we've seen in the last few years where that leads. It leads to an extremely selfish accumulation of wealth in a small number of hands, and to the credit crunch and other disasters that this country is suffering from particularly. It's greed, it's lying, it's dishonesty, it's the banks tricking people. Afatu tijara al-kadib. So this is an important part of our civilization, and that book in particular is certainly worth looking at, Kitab Adab al-Kasb, because it has some very beautiful things that take us away from the idea that the commercial life is something that's not really a proper religious vocation, but something you do to make money, that you choose deen or dunya. No, in fact, in Islam, whatever your path in life might be, you always choose deen over dunya, even if you're running a bank or working in a hospital. It's always deen rather than dunya. And this is part of the way of the Muslims. Imam Al says, وَاقْطَعِ الْحُجُبَ الْكَثِيفَةَ بِالسَّيْرِ عَنْهَا وَاقْطَعِ الْحُجُبَ اللَّطِيفَةَ بِالسَّيْرِ فِيهَا. Deal with the thick veils by traveling around them, and deal with the subtle veils by traveling through them. What he means by the thick veils is forgetfulness of Allah and sin. Just avoid them. And what he means by the thin veils is the world, the distractions, the occupations, the pursuits of the world. In our way, we do not avoid them, we go through them. And this is, again, characteristic of the prophetic way, as we've had occasion to mention. وقال صلى الله عليه وسلم ثلاثة نفر لا يكلمهم الله يوم القيامة ولا ينظر إليهم المنان بعطيته المنفق سلعته بالحلف الفاجر والمسبل إزاره. The Holy Prophet says, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, there are three whom Allah will not look at them on the Yawm al-Qiyamah. The one who makes a show of giving in charity, thereby making the recipient feel small. And the one who sells his goods with a corrupt oath. And the one who dresses extravagantly to manifest pride. وقال صلى الله عليه وسلم ما حلف حالف بالله فأدخل فيها مثل جناح بعوضة إلا كانت نكتة في قلبه إلى يوم القيامة. And he said, صلى الله عليه وسلم, whenever you make an oath by Allah, and there is in it even a gnat's weight of insincerity, there will be a spot in your heart until the end of time. And then he moves on to bearing false witness in a famous hadith which is narrated by Bukhari and Muslim. ألا أنبئكم بأكبر الكبائر الإشراك بالله وعقوق الوالدين ثم قعد وقال ألا وقول الزور. He says, shall I not tell you which are the worst of the mortal sins? Shirk and disrespect for parents. And then he sat and said, and also bearing false witness, qawl az-zur. And this also relates in the world of the scholars and amongst ordinary Muslims as well to lying or dishonesty or carelessness in transmitting the prophetic legacy. That in the world of hadith, there are people who lie about the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam for some sectarian reason, or in order to please their listeners, or simply to make up a good story. قال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم من حدث عني بحديث وهو يرى أنه كذب فهو أحد الكاذبين. Whoever narrates a hadith on my authority and thinks that it's false, he is considered to be amongst the liars. ومن كذب علي متعمدا فليتبوأ مقعده من النار. Whoever lies about me deliberately, let him prepare his resting place in the fire. Now, that's Imam Al Ghazali's first sort of opening shots about lying, and this turns out to be one of the longest and most complicated topics. Of course, lying, bearing false witness, cheating, all of these things, unambiguously major sins and a form of sickness, because it's about the greatest sickness, which is for one's inward to be unlike one's outward, which is a spiritual sickness rather than just making a mistake or deliberately hurting somebody and it's obvious what you're doing. This is a kind of inner sickness. But it's complicated by the fact that there can be certain situations in which lying is actually legitimate or even required. And this is a famous question in ethics that goes back as far as Aristotle. Lying, of course, something that even small children find disgusting. It's the fitra of human beings to be repelled by a lie. But still, such is the complexity of our lives and the moral universe, that there are circumstances in which we should not tell the truth and can sometimes tell something that we deliberately know to be an outright lie. So the Imam has actually quite a long and subtle disquisition on this, which he calls bayanu ma rukhisa fihi min al-kadhib. Those areas, those contexts in which there is a concession allowing us to lie. اعلم أن الكذب ليس حراما لعينه لما فيه من الضرر وعلى المخاطب أو على غيره. Know that lying is not haram in itself, but because of the damage which it does to others and to ourselves. In itself, a lie is just a sound, just words. وَرُبَّ جَهْلٍ فِيهِ مَنْفَعَةٌ وَمَصْلَحَةٌ. There are many situations in which not knowing or ignorance contains benefit and public utility. فالكذب يحصل لذلك الجهل فيكون مأذونا فيه. If in the context of a person of society benefiting from somebody remaining ignorant, then to lie in a way that promotes or maintains that ignorance, he says, is ma'dhun, is permissible. وَرُبَّمَا كَانَ وَاجِبًا, and such lies may even be obligatory. قال ميمون بن مهران الكذب في بعض المواطن خير من الصدق. Maimun bin Mihran, one of the Salaf, used to say, lying in some context can be better than truthfulness. أرأيت لو أن رجلا سعى خلف إنسان بالسيف ليقتله. What about the situation where a man is running behind another man with a sword trying to kill him? فدخل دارا, and he enters somebody's house. فانتهى إليك, and then he sees you, he encounters you. فقال أرأيت فلانا ما كنت قائلا ألست تقول لم أرى. What would you do in that situation if the putative killer with his sword broke into the house as well? Wouldn't you say, I haven't seen him? This is obvious. That's a situation in which you can have an ethical lie. فنقول الكلام وسيلة إلى المقاصد. So we say, this is Imam Al Ghazali, says, speech is a means to achieving certain purposes. فكل مقصود محمود يمكن التوصل إليه بالصدق والكذب جميعا فالكذب فيه حرام. So here he's being very Ghazalian and separating out these different situations. So every praiseworthy purpose which you could accomplish either by telling the truth or by lying, in that situation it is haram to tell a lie. وإن أمكن التوصل إليه بالكذب دون الصدق, and if it's possible to reach it by telling a lie but not by telling the truth, فالكذب فيه مباح, then it is permissible to lie in that situation. إن كان تحصيل ذلك القصد مباحا, if bringing about that particular objective is something that is lawful. وواجب إن كان المقصود واجبا, and it's obligatory if that purpose is an obligatory purpose. كما أن عصمة الدم المسلم واجبة, just as it is an obligation to protect the blood of another Muslim. فمهما كان في الصدق سفك دم امرئ مسلم, so when in telling the truth a believer's blood will be shed, then اختفى من ظالم, a believer who has hidden from a tyrant, فالكذب فيه واجب, it's an obligation in that situation to tell a lie. ومهما كان لا يتم مقصود الحرب أو إصلاح ذات البين أو استمالة قلب المجنى عليه إلا بالكذب فالكذب مباح. Now he gives some other situations, and again this is classical in our ethical literature. To the extent that a military purpose may only be served by telling a lie, or reconciliation between human beings can only happen when a lie is told, or when somebody who has suffered, a victim, can have his heart healed only when he hears a lie about a particular situation. فالكذب مباح, in those situations it's lawful to tell a lie. إلا أنه ينبغي أن يحترز منه ما أمكن. However, it's right to avoid it as much as one can. لأنه إذا فتح باب الكذب على نفسه, because if he's opened this door to telling lies for himself, فيخشى أن يتداعى إلى أن يستغني عنه, then it's possible that he may become so accustomed to this that he no longer is interested in telling the truth. So he may no longer limit himself only to telling lies in situations where it's necessary and ethical. فيكون الكذب حراما في الأصل إلا لضرورة. So the summary is that in its essence, at basis, lying is haram unless there is some necessity, unless there is some pressing need which makes it lawful. والذي يدل على الاستثناء ما روي عن كلثوم. And now he gives some texts from the revelation to indicate the possibility of this exception. قالت ما سمعت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يرخص في شيء من الكذب إلا في ثلاث. I never heard the Holy Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم permit any kind of lying except in three situations. الرجل يقول القول يريد به الإصلاح, when you say something in order to bring about reconciliation. والرجل يقول القول في الحرب, and when you say something in a situation of armed conflict. والرجل يحدث امرأته والمرأة تحدث زوجها, and a man speaking to his wife and a wife speaking to her husband, because for the sake of marital harmony sometimes it is necessary for white lies to be told. وقالت أيضا كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم ليس بكذاب قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم ليس بكذاب من أصلح بين اثنين. The one who reconciles two people is not a liar. فقال خيرا أو نما خيرا, and he speaks what is good, or he brings about what is good. وقالت أسماء بنت يزيد, Asma bint Yazid said, قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم كل الكذب يكتب على ابن آدم إلا رجل كذب بين مسلمين ليصلح بينهما. Every lie is written as a sin upon the son of Adam, except in the case of a man who lies in order to bring about reconciliation between two Muslims. وروي عن أبي كاهل قال وقع بين اثنين من أصحاب النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم كلام حتى تصارما. A dispute, a sharp argument, a quarrel erupted between two of the Sahaba. فلقيت أحدهما فقلت ما لك. I met one of them and said, what's wrong? ولفلان ما لك ولفلان فقد سمعته يحسن عليك بالثناء ثم لقيت الآخر فقلت له مثل ذلك حتى اصطلحا. So the way in which he resolved it was that he went to one person and said, why are you arguing with such and such a person? Because I've heard him saying good things about you. And then he goes to the other party to this dispute and says, why? He says the same thing. Why is it that you're arguing with him when he's said positive things about you? ثم قلت, this is Abu Kahil, who's done this in order to bring about this reconciliation by telling two lies. قلت أهلكت نفسي وأصلحت بين هذين. I've destroyed myself, but I've reconciled these two. He's concerned that he's told two lies. فأخبرت النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم فقال يا أبا كاهل أصلح بين الناس أي ولو بالكذب. And he said, oh Abu Kahil, reconcile people. In other words, even if it's by telling an untruth. Okay, so this is it's a long section, and he makes further differentiations, but essentially it boils down to these three circumstances: that there are ruses and stratagems in times of war. you spread the tale that you're going to march to a particular place, but in fact it's a lie, you're going to march somewhere else, and this is not haram, because the hadith says al-harbu khid'ah, war is all about deceit, stratagems. And in order to bring about reconciliation between people, it can be lawful. And finally, in the context of the situation between a man and his wife. وَقَدْ ظَنَّ ظَانُّونَ. And then he goes on to finish this section by talking about the question of hadith. He's raised it earlier, but he's talking about it in more detail now. Those who invent hadiths for what they claim to be a good purpose. Is this a legitimate use of lying? You're actually improving people, you're telling them a story about how a particular vice will lead to a certain number of years in Jahannam. Isn't that a good thing if it urges them to do good deeds? He says this is the exception. قَدْ ظَنَّ ظَانٌ أَنَّهُ يَجُوزُ وَضْعُ الْأَحَادِيثِ فِي فَضَائِلِ الْأَعْمَالِ. He says some might suppose that it's permissible, on this kind of argument, to invent hadiths about meritorious actions. وَفِي التَّشْدِيدِ فِي الْمَعَاصِي. And in order to alert people to the gravity of sin. وَزَعَمُوا أَنَّ الْقَصْدَ مِنْهُ صَحِيحٌ. And they claim that the purpose of such a lie is a valid one. وَهُوَ خَطَأٌ مَحْضٌ. But this is an absolute error. إِذْ قَالَ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّمَ مَنْ كَذَّبَ عَلَيَّ مُتَعَمِّدًا فَلْيَتَبَوَّأْ مَقْعَدَهُ مِنَ النَّارِ. The Holy Prophet says in the sound hadith, whoever deliberately lies about me, let him prepare for his place in hellfire. وهذا لا يرتكب إلا لضرورة ولا ضرورة إذ في الصدق مندوحة عن الكذب فيما ورد من الآيات والأخبار كفاية عن غيرها. So there's no valid claim to invent hadiths on the grounds that there's darura, there's necessity. In the other cases, in the case of war, in the case of reconciliation, there's a necessity. There's no necessity for inventing hadiths, he says, because there's already enough verses of the Quran and hadiths and other material which render it OTOs, unnecessary to invent more material. So that's how he ends that particular section, and inshallah we move on now. Just a brief treatment of Al-Khamisa Ashara, the 15th defect, Al-Ghiba. وَالنَّظَرُ فِيهَا طَوِيلٌ. He says this requires lengthy investigation. Ghiba is backbiting. And as we'll see, there's complex issues here of criticizing people for opinions that they might hold, which in an academic context or religious context might be valid, or criticizing people in order to warn others of their danger. Don't buy from such and such a shopkeeper because he cheated me last week. Is that backbiting, or is it necessary to alert other people to a danger? It's actually a complex topic. So let's just begin with it. فَلْنَذْكُرْ أَوَّلًا مَذَمَّةَ الْغِيبَةِ وَمَا وَرَدَ فِيهَا مِنْ شَوَاهِدِ الشَّرْعِ. Let's begin, as he normally does, with proof texts from Revelation. وَقَدْ نَصَّ اللَّهُ سُبْحَانَهُ عَلَى ذَنْبِهَا فِي كِتَابِهِ. Allah has explicitly condemned it in His book. وَشَبَّهَ صَاحِبَهَا بِآكِلِ لَحْمِ الْمَيْتَةِ. And has likened the one who engages in backbiting with somebody who eats dead flesh, eats carrion. فَقَالَ تَعَالَى وَلَا يَغْتَبْ بَعْضُكُمْ بَعْضًا أَيُحِبُّ أَحَدُكُمْ أَنْ يَأْكُلَ لَحْمَ أَخِيهِ مَيِّتًا فَكَرِهْتُمُوهُ. Let not one of you backbite another. Would one of you wish to eat the flesh of his dead brother? You would surely detest that. وقال عليه السلام كل المسلم على المسلم حرام دمه وماله وإرضه. The Prophet said, every aspect of the Muslim is sacrosanct for every other Muslim, his blood and his property and his honor. And the Imam will explain that this is therefore a Sharia issue, and indeed backbiting can be subject to legal sanction by the decree of a qadi. It's not just an ethical slip it's also legally actionable because one is, as it were, confiscating something from somebody else. It's a kind of theft. It's a moral theft. And ird is, in most of the systems of Islamic jurisprudence, one of the objects of Islamic law, one of the ends which it aims to protect. And in contemporary language, we might say it's a right. These are human rights, these usul, these 5 principles, that the Sharia exists to protect 5 rights: the right to life, the right to property, the right to lineage, stroke family, the right to religion, and the right to dignity or honor, which is ird, which is what this is talking about. And this is notoriously, in every legal system, one of the hardest things to police. So it raises issues such as common law offences in England, such as slander and libel, which can be treated very seriously by the courts. Compensation can be astronomical. It's a major crime in contemporary as in medieval law. But actually determining what is fair comment and what is libel is famously technical and difficult. And in the Sharia, generally it's left not to the details of the fiqh, but to the discretion of the qadi, which is a standard feature of the operation of Islamic law. And in parentheses, it's important to remember this, that most of Islamic law is in what the qadis actually do and their rulings, and is in the fatwas of the various jurists. Most of Islamic law is not in the books of fiqh. The books of fiqh are not statutory law. And very often we Muslims, and certainly non-Muslims, when they look at Islamic law or Sharia law, this new term that they've invented, assume that to find it, you have to look in the law books of classical Islam. So you look in Imam Al Ghazali's Basit, or you look at Shirazi's Muhaddab, or any of these other big texts, the Hidayah. And that is Islamic law, but that's actually not the case at all. Because Islamic law is effective insofar as it is actually administered, and the judge, the qadi, has much more powers of discernment and determination, and also the fixing of penalties and punishments than is the case for a judge in the Western system. You could say Islamic law is more fluid and more, you could even say libertarian in this sense. It's less prescriptive. And the judge has the books of fiqh to refer to, and he will probably have collections of fatwas on his shelves, but when it comes down to an individual case, it will be the decision of the judge. There's no jury, remember. It will be the decision of the judge to determine whether a crime has been committed, and except in the 6 or 7 cases of had punishment, murder, adultery, and so forth, the actual nature of the punishment, incarceration or some other penalty, is left to the qadi and is not specified in the books of fiqh. It's important, I think, always for us to remind ourselves of this, that the classical manuals of Sharia are not law books as the modern West would understand them. So in this context, it would be the qadi who would determine whether somebody's honor has been infringed. And that's actually pretty wise and even essential when you think about it, because that's such a culturally specific and relative idea, that the judge, who has to be from the community, has to understand the subtleties of the community and what's likely to be implied in, say, a hostile newspaper article, or in an angry exchange over a boundary dispute, or whatever it might be. It's only the qadi who can determine whether speech actually has infringed somebody's ird, somebody's honor. A faraway theorist writing a book of statutory law would never be able to determine that. And this is one of the strengths of the Sharia. If you look at Wa'il Halaq's new book, The Impossible State, he says Islamic law, even though he himself is Christian Palestinian, he says Islamic law is probably the most subtle and brilliant legal system that's ever existed, but it's not understood, least of all by the Muslims themselves, because it was never statutory law. It was always law administered by the qadis, And Muslims nowadays tend to have forgotten that. So the good fit which the law had with individual societies made Islamic law actually quite different in its application and its temper from culture to culture, from class to class, from region to region. I don't want to press on with this issue of ghiba now because it's a long and complicated discussion. Tomorrow, inshallah, you will be away from here, at least most of you will be, and there won't be any classes. But inshallah, there'll be an opportunity on Wednesday morning after Fajr to try and at least race through the rest of Imam Al Ghazali's book. I think one of the things that strikes one when you read Ghazali is how really 95% of it is still directly relevant to ourselves. And the gut reaction that most people have when they read the Ihya is that, oh, this is terribly, it's not that it's very exotic and strange and irrelevant, but it seems terribly severe. That he requires great feats of tahajjud and fasting and a very austere type of social model. But in fact, if you read through all of these sections to the end, you'll find that his rhetorical method is always to be tough at the outset, but then to give an alternative perspective and to recommend the middle way. And as we've seen in this discussion that we've been through in some detail on lying, he begins by saying it's haram and it's the foundation of nifaq, and then he nuances it by explaining, well, there are circumstances in which lying can be permissible and even required. So what's required is the middle way, and that's where our conscience comes in and our humanity, because most of these issues cannot be determined in detail by outsiders prescribing responses for us. It's a judgment call as to whether a lie is actually justifiable in a particular situation. So for instance, the hadith where he says you can tell a lie in the situation where somebody has suffered an offense or an outrage. So for instance, if somebody has been abused as a child and they always thought it was their father and that made it much worse. If the counselor can say, actually it wasn't your father, it was somebody else, that's telling a lie. But that's exactly what the Holy Prophet ﷺ is saying is a permissible and even a praiseworthy form of lying. But to know exactly when one can do that is a judgment call, and that's where the conscience, the damir, comes in. The individual human sensibility as to what's right. And it is in that area that we are most fully morally accountable. We can follow rules and obey laws and get the fiqh practices right, but our humanity is engaged most on those issues where we can see that there's two sides and we have to somehow find an appropriate balance in what may well seem to be the grey areas which populate so much of our moral experience. And that's part of the appeal of Imam Al Ghazali's Ihya. On the one hand, stern, absolute. It's an austere program for personal self-transformation. And he'd been through the mill himself in his own life. But at the same time, it's very alert to human weakness and to the need to see the Sharia and the Sunnah for what they really are, which is practical and compassionate templates for human judgment and human life. These are not detailed blueprints that screw us down to some externally imposed set of values. Instead, it is a treasure trove of dictums, of principles, of different opinions, of legal practices, which it is ultimately up to us, or if we're in a jurisdiction, up to the Qadi or the Mufti to determine. And there's always a plurality of opinions. And Imam Al Ghazali is particularly keen that we should recognize those in humility and that we should respect them. So this is, from the Ihya, you can really learn, paradoxically perhaps, much of the wisdom and the depth of the Sharia. It's not a law book at all, even though at the outset it has basic information from a Shafi'i perspective on Arkan al-Wudu', but that's not really the purpose of the book. The purpose of the book is to explore the way in which revelation reaches into our humanity in a way that we can deal with and that makes us more human in the Adamic rather than the demonic sense. It's not trying to turn us into bloodless, passionless angels. Instead, it's turning us into full human beings. And what's most characteristic about our humanity is the ability to look compassionately at a situation where an absolutist might say, you can never lie, but in fact to see that there can be contexts where that's required. And this nuance is very characteristic of Ghazali. It comes to some extent from his Shafi'i perspective, where the Shafi'is were amongst the first to indicate different gradations of what's preferable, what's mustahab, and so forth. But it's generally part of the Sharia of Islam, and it's a wisdom that often escapes us because in our time, frequently we adhere to religion in a reactive way. That is to say, we feel our identity is threatened and we're being insulted by outsiders, usually powerful outsiders, and therefore the religious choices that we reach for will be particularly rigorous and tight and reactive ones. And that's very common amongst Muslims nowadays. They feel that the Western world is against them and Israel is dreadful and so on and so on. And therefore, as a protest, they adopt the narrowest possible interpretations and also adopt this very un-Islamic idea that the Sharia can become statutory law and the legal code of a nation state. And as Wa'il Halaq points out in his book, that's an impossibility. The Sharia is not statutory law. It's far too diverse and subtle a legal tradition, and it's not designed to be imposed by a state because the state doesn't have any right to legislate in Islam. The ruler is simply there to defend the borders and to appoint judges, to have his name recited in the khutbah, but he is not there to legislate. Only Allah legislates. The scholars interpret the legislation, and the Sharia is this enormously broad range of different interpretations. This is important for us to remember because very often modern Muslims in this reactive mode, which is the kind of inner state which Imam Al Ghazali disliked so much, automatic, reactive, protest religion, much of the rhetoric nowadays is to treat Islamic law as though it was statutory legislation, which is a Western concept which is completely alien to our tradition. So they end up with a kind of totalitarianism.
What about like the Ottoman texts like the Majalla and other things? Like they didn't.
Yeah, I mean that's a good point. The Ottomans in the late 19th century felt under pressure to move beyond the traditional constitutional arrangement whereby the Sultan sat in his palace and led the armies but didn't legislate, and to unify the legal codes of the empire in order to facilitate Turkish integration into the European system of nation states and to facilitate trade and commerce. It was proving difficult to have a network of courts where different judgments were being given in different courts, because the qadis were all completely independent. And Western merchants, when they went to Turkey, wanted to make sure that they could sign contracts which were enforceable the same way by every qadi and every court in the empire. So the Ottomans instituted a series of reforms which essentially made the state the kind of supreme mujtahid, choosing which ahkam to follow. And they put it all together in this book called the Majalla Ahkami Adliya, which was the first attempt to turn Islamic law into statutory law. But you could also say that it was a bogus exercise, because as soon as it becomes statutory law, it's no longer Islamic law. It's brought into a completely different statist model, a top-down model of the imposition of law, rather than the qadis being appointed by local communities and the law, as it were, being part of the community's own exegesis of the revealed legacy. But of course, they had a difficult situation. What does one do? You want to have legislation that fits your religious heritage and identity, but on the other hand, the tradition tells you quite strictly that Islamic law can never be statutory law. So what do you do if you're running a modern nation state? Nobody has a clear answer to that. Anyway, that's taking us a little bit far afield, but inshallah, I think they're setting up outside. I know you've had a long day, but inshallah, this will be a good source of relief. Barakallahu fikum, wal afu minkum, wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.